My name's Lydia Ortega. I think I know most of you. I'm chair of the Department of Economics. Welcome. So if you're looking for seats, just start now to find them over here in the front. Always look in the front. For some reason, those seats are always empty. Okay, so we have some on the left side over there. Grab a seat and relax. This is our last provocative lecture for this semester. If you're planning ahead, we will have a speaker next will be February 14th. The speaker, Jerry Brito, is talking about, is there a market failure in cybersecurity? So as econ majors, you should all know about market failure concepts. As young people, you should all be interested in cybersecurity and your internet. Okay, so I hope you come to that talk and you ask him why he planned it for February 14th. That's Valentine's Day. Okay, so today I'm very excited. I got to hear a little bit of our speaker's presentation. It was really well received by a business group, and he's presenting you with some interesting things to think about, as we always try with the Provocative Lecture Series. I have to mention that I had a student who saw me just before this talk to ask about what she could do in a developing country, and talked about the really significant trials and tribulations that people go through when they don't have the rule of law. It was very, very moving. And then I looked at this talk and I said, well, we're not talking about poor countries, but there are some states that are poor. They're not in as abysmal situation as the poor people in developing countries, but there are people here in the United States suffering because of policies. And sometimes I'm very, very frustrated, as she was frustrated. What can you do in the Sudan? What can you do in a developing country? And I looked at this talk and I said, well, wait a minute. We know what works. We see and test what can be done. Not through some model that's abstract, but through real analysis, comparisons. And it's not a lot of guesswork anymore. This is a guide to economic prosperity, something that in this Christmas season I wish with all my heart for everyone. And so I really welcome you to think through this talk, to open up your questioning mind, challenge our speaker here and at the Barstool meeting, which will be at Flames. I understand there's a sporting event going on, some game, but they did say they would reserve us a spot, okay? So we will be meeting for our traditional Barstool meeting. You're all welcome to come. There's beer, there's pizza. What's not to like, okay? Come and talk about this lecture. Meet our guest speaker. He'll be there. You can pepper him with more questions afterwards. Let me introduce to you now exactly at 5:15. Make sure all cell phones are off. Like I will make mine off. I'm happy to introduce to you Jonathan Williams, who is from the American Legislative Exchange Council, where he works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. Prior to joining ALEC, Jonathan Williams served as staff economist at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, authoring numerous tax policy studies. Along with his co-authors, Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore, Williams created the annual award-winning publication Rich States, Poor States. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Investor's Business Daily. I'm going to let Jonathan talk a little bit more about the organization and about what they do and how they've come up with this wonderful guide. Let's all welcome Jonathan Williams to our lecture series.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you to Professor Ortega for the invitation to join you, and greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where I came from a couple days ago, and it's good to be with all of you tonight. And I have to say, speaking of the game, whatever's going on tonight, it was very nice of the Sharks to cancel their season to not conflict with our lecture tonight and to convening over at Flames later. So what I want to do today is challenge you all to think a little bit differently than what we often think when it comes to politics or policy, which is we often think about everything in a federal lens, that all of our problems and all of our solutions revolve around Washington, D.C., and that it's a real challenge to get away from that mindset. And so in this provocative lecture series, what I'd like you to think about is lessons that we can learn from the 50 state capitals. And as Justice Louis Brandeis once famously called the states, laboratories of democracy, that we can learn what policies are good, what policies may not be, from what's happening across the 50 states. And we do have these 50 laboratories that we've studied now for years. And really what our founders gave us as they set up the United States was this 50-state free trade zone where across states, businesses and individuals can make informed choices based on a series of economic incentives to what makes sense for them and the value of their families and the betterment of their families. And that really has given us a lot of data to study over the years. And that's really one of the reasons why I put together the Rich States, Poor States publication over 5 years ago to look at these 50 laboratories and really see what kind of lessons we can gain from them. One of the first things people often ask me, being from Washington, D.C., other than, hopefully I don't have to dodge any rotten tomatoes or anything once I say I'm from Washington, D.C., I actually don't live within the Beltway. I'm in Virginia. And so one of the things that people often say is, how are things going in Washington these days? And I wish I had a positive answer for you because things are challenging. We have some big challenges ahead. You have everyone here familiar with the fiscal cliff. You've heard this in the news. Why don't I get a few people's perspectives on what your thoughts are on the fiscal cliff in terms of what you think is facing us here within the next few weeks? Anybody want to volunteer to give a few words about what your perception is from the news about the fiscal cliff? Any volunteers? Yeah, the negative aspect. Yeah, basically, it's, people are pretty worried about it. Any other thing that people have gleaned from news coverage? I realize you don't get a whole lot of intellectual stimulation from the newspaper usually when you read those stories, but
a large increase in taxes across the board and very substantial cuts in government spending, which would put the economy back into recession process.
Yeah, well, so basically what happens is less than a month from now, because of some pretty strange legislative rules, tax cuts that have been passed over the last decade expire. And if nothing is done, if there's no deal reached, and we've got gridlock in Washington, we've got the House of Representatives being represented by Speaker John Boehner and Republicans, and we have Harry Reid, Senate Majority Leader of the Democrats on the Senate side. Of course, President Obama is reelected. So we have this gridlock. So if nothing happens within the next, less than a month now, automatically all these taxes go up. Income taxes, investment taxes on capital gains and dividends, lots of deductions could go away. There's a bunch of things that are going to happen on the tax side. On the spending side, they also have this thing called sequestration. Right, you've heard a little bit about this, where these are automatic spending cuts that are going to happen if nothing is done before we hit the fiscal cliff. And so that's really something that D.C. is going to be struggling with. And honestly, I can't tell you what the outcome is going to be. If I knew that, I'd be a very rich person right now. Nobody really knows what's going to happen over the next few weeks. Right now, Congress's popularity hovering around all-time low, about 10%, I think. A member of the United States Senate once recently told me he thinks it's hovering somewhere between the popularity level in North Korea government and the influenza virus. So that's where they kind of think popularity is in D.C. these days. So with that at the federal level, I really want to stay away as much as possible from federal policy since there's all kinds of problems and they're much more difficult to solve at the federal level, I think. One of the other problems that we have is that our business taxes are the highest in the world now. Japan just lowered their corporate business tax rate as of April, making the United States the highest in the world. We have some major competitiveness challenges. If we want to get this economy back on track, we want to start creating private sector jobs again. That's not something I'm going to dwell on, though. I want to talk about some of the good things going on. There's also some challenges at the state level, but I think we can learn a lot of very proactive lessons from what type of policies work at the state level. And so our guide to rich states, poor states is produced by my organization, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which was founded almost 40 years ago to espouse free market principles in state government, limited government, those type of principles. As you can see, we're a nonpartisan organization. We have both Republicans and Democrats that we work with across the 50 states, about 2,100 state legislators from all 50 states, including some in California who we were meeting with earlier this week on Tuesday. Belong to ALEC, and we work as a partnership with the private sector job creators to get their input on ideas for what can help turn states around. And so as part of our mission is to disseminate materials like Rich States, Poor States. And now this is in our 5th edition of the book, which is a free download, by the way, on our website, alec.org. You can go and download the PDF. You can do that, and hopefully you do that later today. But for Rich States, Poor States, we put it together basically to answer some of these questions of what policy matters, what matters the most for growth. And what we find is free market policy, it really does matter at the state level. And since our founders put together this 50-state free trade zone, we get to take a lot of deduction away from policies, and some working and some not. And states have all been in tough situations, so there's no such thing as a perfect state in terms of policy. You hear a lot about some of the states that are getting it right more often than not, like Texas, for instance, and Utah, and some of those states that actually have surpluses today. California, of course, falls more or less on the poor state side of the rich states, poor states equation because of just so many of the problems that this state's encountered over the years. And we're going to talk more about why we rank California poorly. One of the neat features of rich states, poor states is we actually rank every state 1 through 50 on their economic competitiveness. And we look at tax policy, regulatory policy, labor policies that are conducive to private sector growth. And so that's really in a snapshot what rich states, poor states is about. But I want to walk through some of the differences in the policy areas that we measure, especially on pensions, on budgets, and on taxes at the state level, because all those things matter for growth. They matter tremendously for businesses as they look to invest. They're not just looking to invest in California versus Arizona, for instance, but now, as I mentioned, we've got all these federal problems hanging over our heads. So these same companies may be looking to invest not only between California and Arizona, but between California and India and Arizona. And so keeping the global perspective in mind is also key, but we're going to focus mostly on the state level today. Now, a couple of differences, obviously, between state level policy and federal policy. As I mentioned, federal policy gets all the attention, and that's unfortunate, but at the state level, we don't have printing presses, for one thing. That's really the big difference, is that at the federal government level, whenever they have a shortage, they just turn on the printing presses. Or now, more technology, now they just call it quantitative easing. So now we've done 1, 2, and we're quantitative easing our way to infinity, I think, at this point. And we'll see how that catches up on the monetary policy side of things over the long term. The other big difference between the federal level and the state level is that at the state level, at least ostensibly, states have to balance their budgets. California doesn't. They get around it. There's many ways that states use to get around it, but at least ostensibly you have this requirement of a balanced budget. Some states have a very strict balanced budget requirement, which actually does keep spending and taxes in line. Other states like California just issue debt and use the initiative process to get their way around any restrictions on the growth of government. At the federal level, obviously, we don't even pretend that we have a balanced budget requirement at all. So that's really a couple of the big differences between federal and state. So in Rich States, Poor States, we have what we call the 10 Golden Rules of Tax Policy. My co-author, Art Laffer, who was President Ronald Reagan's economic advisor and goes way back to when President Reagan was governor of this state, and Dr. Laffer worked with him on developing economic policies here. And he's, of course, most famously known for what you know from economics is the Laffer curve, which is, as legend would have it, at a bar one evening on a cocktail napkin, as many good, deals are made at bars on cocktail napkins. He came up with this theory of the Laffer curve. We're going to talk more about that. He and Steve Moore really were very instrumental in putting these 10 golden rules together of effective taxation. Let's run through them fairly quickly here. This is pretty basic. Anybody that's taken Economics 101 realizes this is just a truism when it comes to economics, is when you tax something, you get less of it. And when you tax something less, you get more of it. That's just basic incentives. Taxes are a direct incentive away from doing something, whatever that is. If you're taxing consumption or sales, you're going to consume less of something relative to what it would be without the tax. Or income, you may work or save or invest less because of that tax burden being placed on that income. This is key because individuals don't work for the privilege of paying taxes. Individuals work for their future or present consumption. And that's something we often take for granted. Sometimes we just think individuals aren't going to change their behavior whatsoever if we raise taxes, and that's just completely wrong. Because principle number 3 here, taxes create a wedge between the cost of working and rewards from working. That's something that obviously when you'd make that decision to get up at 5 in the morning and go work that extra job or something to make ends meet and to pay tuition, you're going to want to make sure you're keeping a good enough chunk of those dollars to make it worthwhile of getting out of bed in the morning. Everybody has opportunity costs, right, and trade-offs where at a certain point people are going to stop deciding to go work those extra hours and they're going to choose to do something that they want to do more, whether it's leisure or they sleep in maybe. People are sensitive like that to tax changes, and keeping that in mind is important. This gets to a little bit here of the Laffer curve theory, which is when you increase tax rates, it does not lead to a dollar for dollar increase in tax revenues because people do change their behavior. It doesn't always raise revenue when you cut taxes, but you do not lose what they would tell you lose just on a static basis. And then when tax rates become too high, you actually could get a reduction in tax receipts because of the Laffer curve effect as people change their behavior. And then this is very important because all taxes affect behavior, but not all taxes are created equally. And so when you look at the various forms of taxes that you can choose to pay for government, and we're not anarchists, at least I'm not an anarchist. I think you should have some level of government, just some basic level of government to provide certain core functions that I think we should probably have. We can disagree about that later at Flames if you'd like over a beer. But when it comes to that, if we have some limited level of government, you do have to find the most efficient way of paying for it. And I think that it's pretty clear based on theory and based on practice, both internationally and here in the States, that taxes on the most mobile forces or most mobile factors are really the most damaging for economic growth. So taxing capital, as we talked about this fiscal cliff, those are some of the most damaging taxes you can choose. Capital gains, dividend, income taxes, those are some of the most mobile. People can avoid them the easiest, especially in this day and age. Capital is obviously awfully mobile. It does not go where it's not wanted. And that's something that we often have to keep in mind when we discuss tax policy. Raising tax rates on one source of revenue may reduce tax revenues in another source as well. This is something that's key because if you're going to raise an income tax, let's say, and you drive people out of the state, you drive business owners out, and this is California's really big problem, is that, over the last 10 years, if you look at the number of Americans coming to California from the other 49 states versus the number of Californians going to the other 49 states, California is on net down 1.5 million Americans over the last decade. And it's chasing out business owners, it's chasing out entrepreneurs. And so while you raise a tax on the income, let's say, like just happened with the proposition that was on the ballot, California is now the highest tax state in the country on personal income. It was not before the proposition. It just leapfrogged a couple of other states, and now over 13% state local personal income tax, highest in the country. And so when you've chased people away, you don't even just lose their income tax revenue. You lose their sales tax revenue, their property tax revenue. Everything they bring to fund the state of California is lost when they move to another state. And there's tons of examples of individuals going and creating businesses in other states that have left California because of poor tax policy. This is key, and this is something that is very clear in the economics literature. Left, right, center, economists generally agree that you want to have a tax that's a broad-based and low rate. You don't want high-rate taxes, and you don't want tax policy picking winners and losers and favoring some over others. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. And then this one, income transfer payments or welfare sometimes do create this de facto tax on work. And when you're looking for somebody that's trying to move from public assistance into the workforce, and they go from not paying taxes because they're receiving government benefits, and then going to work and giving up the government benefits plus paying taxes on that income, the marginal disincentive, that marginal tax rate can be huge. It can be 100% in some cases. It can be devastating and really disincentivize people from entering the workforce. So as Dr. Laffer always says, if you tax people who work and you pay people not to work, should we be really surprised when more people don't work? That's basic incentives, folks, and that's the incentives that states and our country has really embedded into our system, and that's unfortunate. That needs to change and make it more incentive and more advantageous for people to look for jobs and actually join the workforce in the private sector. And then this is what rich states, poor states is really based upon. If you have two locations, A and B, and one location raises taxes and the other one lowers taxes, you're giving a pretty direct incentive for individuals and businesses to move to that lower tax jurisdiction. And throughout the book, we're going to talk about some of the applications of this principle and that data. So when I talk about fiscal policy, there's really two sides to the same fiscal coin, as I like to say. This is, first of all, we're going to talk about spending. Because at the state level, since you really can't run large debt, except for California and a couple other states that have found their way around those requirements, and you can't print money, ostensibly then what you have is you have to tax what you spend. And it's really two sides of the same fiscal coin. Now, when it comes to spending, the great Thomas Sowell here from California, everybody familiar with Thomas Sowell? I'm sure a few of you have read his work. Fantastic economist, one of my favorite people to read in the newspaper as well. His famous line on spending is this: the first law of economics that you learn is scarcity of resources, right? You can't have everything you want. There's a certain finite amount of resources. But the first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics and just pretend that we have as much as we want to spend on everything that we want to spend it on. And that's really the problem when it comes to spending. Now, many times at the state level, when it comes to spending, many times we just take last year's budget and, let's say, add 8% or add 12%, and most of the discussion and debate is around whether we add 10% or we add 14% to the state budget, instead of looking at some of the underlying efficiency questions. And I think this is key, just from an economics perspective, is realizing that not all spending is created equal as well. Some is, justified, some is probably not justified. But believe it or not, we looked at Washington State as a case study. They had a $2.4 billion budget shortfall 10 years ago. And with a Democrat governor and a Republican legislature, they came together and said, we're not prioritizing our spending. We're just going on and spending from last year, and we're adding things and spending more this year, and we're spending more the next year after that year. And we just continue this gradual increase without examining whether we should be spending the money at all. And so, for instance, each state has an agency director over various state departments. Now, Washington State, before this process of priority-based budgeting, their agencies did not even have to have mission statements as to what type of value that spending provided to taxpayers. And I did a survey across the 50 states after this to put together the book. Even today, 25 out of the 50 states do not require their agencies and their departments at the state level to show any type of reasoning of why they're spending the money the way they are. That's a big problem. And as states now have red ink, California has lots of red ink, enough for everybody, but a ton of states do. And we've seen over the last few years, upwards of 40 or 45 states have been in a budget deficit situation. So some people will say, well, this might be just a shortage of tax revenue, or this is because of the economic downturn of 2008. That may be part of the case of the economic downturn. It certainly did not help. But the 10 years prior to 2008, state and local spending grew 90% faster than private sector real GDP. So in a situation where your spending is your taxes, and your spending at the state and local level is not 19% greater, it's 90% greater than real private sector GDP over that period, that's a big problem at the state level. And that really set states up to fail, especially when the market crash happened. Any ideas on what people think about the greatest threat to state finances today? There's a lot of threats out there. There's a lot of uncertainty out there for states. What I think the greatest threat is for state finances today is the unfunded pension obligations for public employees. And this is something that all of you probably have followed very closely here in San Jose, having the initiative pass earlier, Measure B, I believe it was called, with about 70% of the vote to make changes going forward to make the pension system more solvent. This is something that is not unique here to San Jose. It's not unique to California. In fact, when I go out to meet with state legislators from the 50 states, they often say to me, well, yeah, we know we have problems with pensions, but we're not California. And that's usually their response. Now, today, really the best funded pension plan is still in a world of bad shape. Now, before the market crash, and this devastated state pensions, by the way, most state pensions lost, or many state pensions lost, between 20 and 30% of their asset value in the market crash around 2008. Huge devastation. So the best funded pension system before the market crash was Utah, and they claimed that they were 100% funded prior, or just over 100% funded prior to the market crash. And after the crash, they've said, well, after we've got a big problem, we're 70% funded now. And so that was the best funded state pension system. Obviously, you get into the likes of California, Illinois, some of the states that you really hear about as being a huge problem, much, much worse than Utah. And so what we've seen is lots of places looking at reform. And this is not, let me just reiterate, this is not a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's not even a liberal versus conservative versus libertarian issue. This is just a mathematics issue that we have at the state and local level. And unless we make changes to the way that public pensions are funded, we're not going to even be able to secure and the promises that have been made to current retirees and current workers. That's why changes must go forward to new workers as a no-brainer. And that's something that I was just meeting with San Jose City Council member Pete Constant earlier today, and he was a real leader on the pension reform here in San Jose. But San Diego also passed a measure earlier this year with 70% support. You had Rhode Island, where I could probably count the number of Republicans on both of my hands in the entire state legislature of Rhode Island. They passed pension reform this year. Utah, as I mentioned, all new hires going into a defined contribution system. So all of you that have worked in the private sector and have had jobs out there, you don't get defined benefit plans anymore in the private sector. That went away, a decade or two ago. This is something that is almost exclusively a state and local government issue at this point. And so there's a real divide there. But there is some movement. And I think that cooler heads are going to prevail, and it's not going to be such a issue of demagoguery as it is going to be solutions, I hope. And one of the reasons is, if you look at these three individuals, we have Bill Gates Jr., we have Warren Buffett, and we have Willie Brown. Everyone here remember Willie Brown, former Speaker of the California Assembly, and now I believe still writes a column for the Chronicle. These three individuals, what they have in common is that none of them are Republicans. None of them are conservatives. None of them are really that market-oriented in many cases. You could make a case that a couple of them are. But all these three individuals, what they do have in common is they realize there's a major, major problem when it comes to funding pensions going forward. You have Bill Gates Jr., who has spent a year of his life studying the underfunding of pensions and what it means to taking away dollars from the classroom because of these expensive pension systems that is taking dollars out of the classroom. He actually, his words not mine, calls the accounting for state and local pensions fraudulent. That's Bill Gates Jr., and we're going to talk a little bit about the accounting. We have any accounting majors in the audience today? All right, well, we're going to talk accounting here in a second. Warren Buffett, he says that, obviously state and local pensions are a huge problem as well. He thinks that we ought to be assuming much different assumptions when it comes to funding pensions. How much do you think pensions are estimating that they're going to earn over the next 30 years in their pension investments? 8%. Exactly. Professor Ortega has extra credit. 8% is about the median across the 50 states that states think they're going to earn over the next 30 years, every year for the next 30 years, uninterrupted, on average. They think they're going to be able to meet that 8% assumption. Now, if you look at the S&P over the last 5 years, you see a little over 2% rate of return. You look at 10-year window, still not 8%. And you go back a ways, and yes, the historical average is closer to 8%. But I don't think that we can use historical averages going forward. I think there's a great argument to be made. We're really in a new normal situation for economic stagnation at this point. At the national level, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, said that we probably won't see a national recovery until 2018. We have many estimates like that I think we're really going to be in a new normal. Willie Brown. I brought something I carry around, and I've carried around with me for a couple of years. You can tell how tattered the paper is here. He said something very interesting in his San Francisco Chronicle column a couple of years ago that I like to respond to, and this is not my statement. This is his. He said, the deal used to be that civil servants were paid less than private sector workers in exchange for an understanding that they had job security for life. But we politicians, pushed by our friends in labor, gradually expanded pay and benefits to private sector levels while keeping the job protections and layering on incredibly generous retirement packages that pay ex-workers almost as much as current workers. He goes on to say, talking about this is politically unpopular and potentially even career suicide for most office holders. But at some point, someone is going to have to get honest about the fact that 80% of state, county, and city budget deficits are due to employee costs. Either we do something about it at the ballot box, or a judge will do something about it in bankruptcy court. This is Willie Brown. And he finishes by saying, if you think I'm kidding, just look at Vallejo. Wow. This is Willie Brown, and there's no coincidence that we have Vallejo, California on the cover of our book this year, just because of the horrible financial problems that they've gone through. The city manager of Vallejo was asked, how did you get in this situation where you've gone through this bankruptcy proceeding now for years? And he said, well, we have 3 police departments and 3 fire departments, 1 that's working and 2 that are retired. And that was his response. And this is nothing, I guess, is not a knock against police or fire. But the fact of the matter is this is a big dollar and cents question for state and local governments, how they're going to handle this going forward. And when you have people as diverse as you conservative Republicans in Utah making this reform, and people like Willie Brown and people in Rhode Island making this reform, this is, I think, the largest challenge facing state governments. Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, also follows this point of view. And he recently was quoted in the New York Times as saying property taxes will have to go up 150% in the city of Chicago if they do not enact fundamental pension reform. That, once again, is a trade-off. Not only are you taking dollars out of the schools potentially, but you may be raising property tax levies potentially very high, as in the city of Chicago. Now, some people say there's not really a pension crisis, and they try to make this point by saying, well, we've lost 30%, but we're going to gain 30% back, and then we'll be okay. Now, need I remind you, 6th grade math class, is when you lose 30% and then you gain 30% back, how many here know that you're not where you started? Okay, we have a good crew. We know what we're doing here. So let me just walk you through the example quickly. So if you start with $100, you lose 30%, you have a $30 loss, you're at $70. You gain back 30% on that $70, you're at $91. You have a $21 gain, and at the end you have a $9 net loss. And it doesn't seem like a big problem here. You repeat that equation a few billion times, and you're talking real money. And that's a big problem at the state level. And the other one here is if you have a compound 8% rate of return, if you assume 8%, let's say that the states are right, if you had taken this back in January 2000, take the Dow Jones average at 11.5, do a compound 8% rate of return today, 28,000 we'd be at the Dow. What was it today? 13, a little under 13 maybe? That just shows you how far off we are in our estimates as well on the assumed rate of return. Now, the other side of the equation, as I mentioned, spending is one side, taxes are how you pay for it. And so let's look at the tax side of the equation from our research. And, I'm a tax economist, and I kind of get into this tax policy stuff. I think it's exciting. It can be exciting. It doesn't have to be boring. It's not like Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It doesn't have to be dull. The difference between an introverted tax economist and an extroverted tax economist, right? The introverted tax economist looks at his shoes when he talks to you, but the extroverted tax economist looks at your shoes when he talks to you. So that's the world that I come from. And I see my accounting friend appreciates that joke. So we can make the same one about actuaries probably. But anyways, on taxes, what we did is we came up, this took us a couple of years to do. So talk about a model of efficiency is it took us a couple of years with our legislative members to coalesce around what we think are the 5 best principles of tax policy that can be applicable at the state, local, or federal levels. And so, first of all, simplicity. This is a pretty easy one, that it's pretty much a no-brainer that you shouldn't have a tax policy system that extracts a deadweight loss cost on the economy because of people wasting time and money complying with complexity of the tax code. Unfortunately, at the federal level, with the federal personal and corporate income taxes, we waste billions of man-hours a year, or I should say lose billions of dollars and waste untold hours of work that are taken out of the private productive private sector and are used into just complying with needless complexity of the tax law. That's something I think everybody can agree on. Transparency. This one is kind of interesting when you look at the local level, especially. Many times you don't realize how many different localities have taxing authority over your income, over your sales, or if you own property, or even if you rent property, you're paying property taxes because your landlords will pass it on, of course. But transparency. In some states, believe it or not, they actually have taxing districts that can tax you that are mosquito abatement districts that have taxing authority over you as property or sales or income. There's some states that have library districts that can tax you certain extra taxes and fire and other type of districts. And that's awfully important. And so we actually worked with a group to put together a website where you can type in your address, your zip code, and you could actually see exactly how many different localities can tax you and have authority over your property or your sales or your income. Just so as people are looking at places potentially to buy property or move, you have that type of information. I think that should be pretty much a solid principle of tax policy, of at least knowing who has authority over your property. Then neutrality. This one is basically the concept that government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers. That ought to be strictly in the marketplace. And so actually I think one of the most dangerous developments at the state and federal level is how big business and big government collude sometimes, and when big government starts picking favorites, picking winners and losers, and it does this in a variety of ways, really. Probably the most egregious is when government gives cash grants, direct cash payments to companies that are generally, these are politically favored companies. They have to have great connections to get this type of deal. That's the most egregious type of, I'd say, really crony capitalism, if you've probably heard that term used before. Other less egregious forms, but still, I think, cronyist, is when big government and big business collude to have special tax treatment for certain businesses or certain industries. Especially bad is when a certain company goes down and lobbies and it has a provision added to the income tax system just for a particular benefit, a private benefit of that particular company. That's, I think, one of the arguments in favor of getting rid of income-based taxes anyways, is you get away from some of this cronyism and game playing through the political process. And so really taxes ought to treat people equally and not let the government pick winners and losers. That's the neutrality principle. And then when we talk to business owners, and we work with hundreds of businesses across the country, and one of the things that they really want to know is predictability. And that's something that is key. They don't want to see the rules of the game changed on them once they've made a $1 million or maybe $1 billion investment in one state or the other. Now, the single worst thing you can do when it comes to predictability is do what California just did on your initiative. And what happened was, how many people know that the tax rates went way up, but they didn't just go up for people going forward. They actually retroactively went up. So you don't only have higher taxes going forward, you have to pay higher taxes as of January 1, 2012. At the start of this year, so when you're talking about a business owner that has made their plans for the year and has allocated capital and made business planning decisions based on a certain type of tax law, and then after the fact, the government comes back and says, whoa, not only going forward do you owe more, but what about those last 10 months? We want that money now too. That is the absolute worst type of unpredictability that government can have embedded in its tax system. And then finally, the first 4 principles, I think, are necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions on their own. Because you can have a very simple, transparent, neutral, and predictable tax system. But if the tax rates are too high, it doesn't get you very far. So if you have a 100% tax rate, you can be very simple, but it's not going to get you very far when it comes to growth, because the pro-growth principle or the competitiveness principle, I think, is key. And that principle outweighs all the rest of them. And that's what rich states, poor states really gets into as well. So the Laffer curve, as I mentioned, we talked about it briefly earlier, but here it is illustrated on the slide for you all to see. Now, this concept has gotten a large amount of criticism over the years, since the 70s when this was really put on that cocktail napkin. And it's been called voodoo economics. It's been called all kinds of things, pejorative, to say that somehow this is wrong. But let's look at it at a very basic level. At a 0% tax rate, how much revenue do you raise for the government? That's the easy half of the equation. At a 100% tax rate, how much do you raise for the government in terms of revenue out of that tax? 0, right? So if you tax something, especially a productive activity like income, at 100%, does anybody work for the privilege of paying taxes? Right? That was one of our first golden rules. It doesn't happen. You will not get out of bed at 6 a.m. to go work for a 15-hour day if you don't get to keep anything at all. Now, Ronald Reagan once told a story when he was an actor before he got into politics. This was before the Reagan tax cuts. It was before the John F. Kennedy tax cuts of the 1960s. This goes way back. So our federal marginal personal income tax rate was how high, would you say, before the Reagan and before the JFK tax cuts? Yes, over 90%. So he happened to be in the 91% bracket. At a certain point of the year, he would get to that 91% bracket, and he would stop making movies, because at that point, for him, his subjective value was that was no longer worth it for me to expend these resources of mine and spend my time on this once I only get to keep 9 cents on the dollar. That's the Laffer curve. Of course, tax rates have come down over time. President Kennedy cut rates to the 70% range, and then when Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, he took rates from 70% down to 28%. We've come back some since then. But really what this illustrates is the behavioral changes in people's ability of taxes to raise revenue. Now, some groups out there have talked about how weather and other factors matter more for state growth than taxes or other type of policy variables. So my first challenge to this question is, where is this magic dial that elected officials have to automatically change the weather if they don't like it? Right? It doesn't exist. You're pretty much stuck with what God gave you when it comes to weather. And when it comes to natural resources, you have a little bit more of flexibility, because you can choose to explore, you can choose not to explore. And we're seeing really the boom in the Dakotas right now. I think North Dakota, 2.9% unemployment today because of the oil boom. But wouldn't California kill to have 2.9% unemployment again? Now, California, as a policy decision, has decided not to explore for the most part, and especially new exploration. And that's a conversation for another day, of course. But after making that policy decision, it really has to live with it. So you really can't legislate new natural resources. You can't really legislate better weather. But some groups say that those type of things matter more for growth than taxes. I tend to think that you have to focus on the items that legislators can actually change. But nonetheless, let's address this for a moment. Two of the places that I've been over the last year, Maui in Hawaii, and then California. San Diego is one of my favorite spots. I didn't really ever want to leave because the weather is just so great there. Didn't really want to go back to Washington, D.C. So what has happened, and I realize that the color on this might not be great. You might not be able to make it out. But in Hawaii, more Americans have chosen to leave Hawaii than go there for 8 out of the last 10 years. And then in California, as I mentioned, California has a net loss of over 1.5 million Americans over the last 10 years that have chosen to go to one of the other 49 states. Now, if it was all about weather, these states ought to be booming, right? Alaska, believe it or not, has grown faster than Hawaii has over the last 10 years. And, it's a really interesting argument there. I just don't think it holds a lot of merit. Now, one of the concepts in economics we've talked about for probably 50 years at this point is the concept that people vote with their feet. And they will choose their location across our 50 laboratories based on various subjective factors and values. You know, sometimes people go to be with family, and sometimes people do go for better weather occasionally. Though a lot of snowbirds go from my home state of Michigan down to Florida in the winter to get away from the ice and snow. But one of the things that we've really tracked in rich states, poor states is the census data, and then IRS comes out with their statistics of income data to show not only who's leaving, but how much of the capital are they taking with them. So California is one of the largest losers of capital over the last 10 years as businesses pull out, as I mentioned. But here, in terms of in-migration, for people, states that are actually gaining population today from the other 49 states, you have Florida, Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia, all the biggest recipients of Americans over the last 10 years. The biggest losers in terms of outmigration, New York, California, Illinois, Michigan, and New Jersey. Now, in Washington, sometimes we don't really care what's happening in the state level because we have this complex that all decisions have to happen in Washington, D.C. But one time it does matter is every 10 years, because you know what happens every 10 years? We have the census, and then what we have this process called redistricting and reapportionment where they change the makeup of the Congress and the U.S. House. And they do this based on population data. So this is when we pay attention to what happens in state population. So over the last 10 years, the states that are shaded in dark blue gained congressional seats because of population inflow. And the states that gained the most was Florida, that gained 2 congressional seats, and Texas, which gained 4 congressional seats over the last 10 years. Anybody know roughly how many people are in a congressional seat today? Yes, it's a little over 700,000 is per congressional seat. So that's a ton of people that have moved into Texas over the last 10 years. The states that lost the most, New York lost 2 congressional districts, and Ohio lost 2 congressional districts. But you can see, once again, a very regional issue there with the states losing. And then the next slide here, this is a historical look at over the last 50 years, the states that have lost the most population and then therefore have lost the most congressional representation. New York has lost 14 congressional seats over the last 50 years. Pennsylvania, 9, Ohio, 8, Illinois, 6, and then some of the others. So basically you have a Rust Belt feel, and I think the Northeast is almost becoming America's new Rust Belt because of poor policy and expensive business locations. Now, as we talked about, not all taxes are created equally. And I think one of the most damaging taxes will be any tax on capital. This particular comparison that I want to walk through compares there are 9 states across the country that do not have a personal income tax on wages, on wage income. And we compare those 9 states. And so those 9 states are Alaska, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming. And then the states with the highest personal income taxes, which have an average top rate of almost 10%. Now, after California's proposition, that average rate's going to go up since you're going to be over 13%. But California already falls in that group of Ohio, Maine, Maryland, Vermont, New Jersey, Oregon, Hawaii, and New York outside of California. So what we did is we took a 10-year look back, a comparison, to see roughly how the states without income taxes are doing compared to the states with the highest income taxes at the state level. So one measure is gross state product growth over 10 years. The high income tax states, about 42% gross state product growth. So, you know, that sounds okay, right? But the states without personal income taxes, almost a 25% premium over the last decade alone. Population growth, as we talk about people who vote with their feet towards the more favorable locations across the 50 states, 5.5% population growth in the high income tax states, almost 14% population growth over just 10 years in the no income tax states. In fact, you listen to some of the stories from the Dakotas. North Dakota still has an income tax for now, but South Dakota is a non-income tax state, and they're growing so quickly up there that they really, they're housing people in hotels, the workers that are going up there working. You hear stories that there's just such a shortage of people at the moment that you're paying people that are flipping burgers at Wendy's, $20 or $25 an hour. So if this California thing doesn't work out for you guys, at least you have a fallback option there if you want to go to North Dakota. Now, I'd recommend going after April because it's going to be like 0 degrees for the next few months up there. Tax receipt growth. The highest income tax states, about 45% tax receipt growth, but in the no income tax states, over 80% tax receipt growth. Now, some people may be confused by this because, you hear oftentimes you need to have high taxes to have high tax revenue. Now, there's a couple of factors playing into this. Now, one is that natural resources have been very successful over the last 10 years. And so a couple of the no-income tax states, Alaska and Wyoming, are pretty heavily dependent on natural resource income. And so that certainly factors in. But even if you were to isolate those two states out and take the 7 that are remaining and compare them, the percentage still outdoes the states with the highest income taxes over the last 10 years. And one of the reasons I think why is this is really a challenge to kind of the progressive left-wing worldview, is that you need to have high income taxes to raise enough revenue. I think the successful way to raise sustainable revenue for government is to grow your tax base, not grow your tax rates. And so that's really the key to Texas and their success, is that they certainly are not charging an income tax on those 4 new congressional districts full of people coming in, but you have all those people paying state sales taxes, state property tax, state and local property taxes, and all the other ways that Texas goes about funding things. And Texas has good roads. They have lots of quality services there because of some of that revenue that's coming in. And then finally, we look at job growth. And this is something that almost every elected official wants to say, yeah, I'm out here creating jobs. So first of all, be very suspicious anytime you hear an elected official go say that we just created a job. I've never seen a public official create a job without first extracting resources from the private sector to do that, and taking jobs out of the private sector than to create a job, quote unquote, create a job in the public sector. So as much as you like, and parties on both parties are guilty of this, talking about how we've implemented this policy and created jobs, it just doesn't happen. Jobs are created from the private sector, from job creators, from risk takers and entrepreneurs, not politicians. But that being said, let's take a look at the job creation record of the states with the highest income taxes, which is zero, no income or no job creation. In fact, negative 1.68% job growth over the last 10 years versus about 5.3% job growth in the no income tax states over the last 10 years. Now, you may be asking the critical questions, as I hope you are in your minds at this time, that, Williams, you're kind of full of it here. You're just making this quick comparison, and what does this have to do with anything? Now, first of all, I would say this is a 10-year period we're looking at. This is not a snapshot. This is not a one-year growth factor we're looking at. We're looking at 10 years' worth of economic growth in these 2 groups of states. These groups of states have not changed much over the last 10 years. In fact, all those 9 states without income taxes, all have been without income taxes all throughout those 10 years. And let me also say that if you were to extend the experiment beyond 10 years and go, if we have 30 or 40 years worth of data, which we do, to go back, if you take the no income tax states over a 40-year period of data and compare them with the states that have the highest income taxes, you find similar relationships over that 40-year period. The other thing we do as we look at, believe it or not, if you go back 50 years, there were 20 states without an income tax. Now it's down to 9. So 11 states have enacted an income tax over the last 50 years. And if you were to compare their relative economic growth and health prior to the income tax and then post-income tax in all 11 of those states, every one of those states have lost economic vitality after depending on an income tax. I think income tax is one of the most damaging ways to raise revenue. And one of the reasons why, even if you say, I'm non-ideological, I don't necessarily believe in markets, hopefully nobody here believes that, but if you just took it from a pure public finance perspective, the best way to raise revenue, the type of revenue you want, is sustainable revenue that does not fluctuate and it doesn't give you the boom and bust cycles. California has become emblematic of the problems with boom and bust cycles in state budgeting. When times are good, Silicon Valley here is booming. You have capital gains and dividends. You have IPOs, and you have tons of cash coming in. They thought they were going to get a big IPO with Facebook and with state revenue. It didn't really work out the way that they were hoping in terms of state revenue. But nonetheless, when times are good here, they're pretty good, right, in California. And then when times are bad, as we've seen over the last few years, and double-digit unemployment, times are really bad. And so California, with this boom and bust cycle, is very hard for state budgeting officials to actually make it work without cutting core services sometimes, or without raising taxes when you would raise it during a downturn and really multiply your problems. And so the most volatile source of revenue at the state level is corporate income taxes, and that's the one that really spikes up and down here. The second most volatile is the blue blue line, which is personal income taxes, and the least volatile source of funding state governments, at least among the, we have a, now everybody can see the slide, I think. We did that on purpose. The least volatile source of revenue here is sales tax. And, like I say, all taxes affect behavior. Some just affect it more than others. And so we'll take advantage of the darkness here for a second so you can see some of the small numbers here, too. We just basically do the comparison, there we go, lights are on. The comparison, what we did with personal income taxes, we redo that comparison with corporate income taxes. And I'm not going to go through every one of these points at the moment. But the relationship, once again, exists between the low corporate income tax states and the highest corporate income tax states. Now, one very important concept to remember when it comes to tax policy, and this is where I think we've gotten off a lot when it comes to policy making, is many times you'll hear, well, you can't cut business taxes because, it's going to be passed on to an individual or it's going to be bad for individuals in some way. But here's something that if you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, you've probably seen in print, but it's a little counterintuitive. That is, businesses don't pay taxes, people do. Now, you're saying, Williams, what do you mean by that? Of course business pay taxes. Now, when I go to some business groups and make this statement, I get some head scratching sometimes because some people are like, of course, we pay quarterly tax payments to the IRS and we pay a lot in taxes. That's the legal incidence of a tax. The economic incidence of the tax, whereas who bears the burden of a tax on business? That's a bit of an unresolved question. But what's not unresolved, and in fact, all levels of economists, both liberal, conservative, you name it, generally agree that individuals will pay any tax on business. We're just not exactly sure what group of individuals sometimes, and that depends on the product and the market and a lot of different factors. But that's the important point to remember is anytime you hear we got to stick it to big business, we got to stick it and job creators have to pay more, that's going to be a tax on individuals. It's a tax on you in some form or another. And as I mentioned, one of the principles of tax policy that's very important is transparency. But one of the things that corporate taxes and business taxes lack fundamentally is transparency, is we do not know which group of individuals will pay that business tax. So when you go buy a Starbucks, how much of that Starbucks latte is embedded corporate income tax? Anybody have an idea? I don't have an idea. Nobody has an idea because it depends a lot on the circumstances. But what we do know based on theory is there's going to be an embedded tax cost on any product that you buy. Also, there are several groups. So you have the consumers where you can see the price of goods go up. You just don't know how much, as I mentioned with that example. If you're a worker, you're going to earn less or you're going to have fewer job opportunities or fewer promotions or bonuses because corporate taxes are going to be passed along to workers. And then investors. If you're an investor in a business, you're going to get a less return on your investment. But the bottom line is individuals will pay the tax. So as I mentioned, in rich states, poor states, we rank the 50 states based on competitiveness, and we equally rank 15 factors. Tax policy, labor policy, regulatory policy, basically a business cost structure of if a business wants to invest in California versus one of your neighboring states, what's it going to mean to their bottom line? And one being best, Utah is actually ranked number one in our index all 5 years that we've produced it. And one of the keys to Utah's success is their predictability. And their predictability at generally low tax rates. They actually were one of the states that went to a flat tax several years ago at the state level. Also, as I mentioned, they were one of the pioneers when it comes to state pension reform. So if you're looking at certainty as a business, there's a few states I would probably rule out right away because of the pension crisis and the uncertainty there. Utah's already fixed their pension problem. They still have some issues, but they pale in comparison to those of Illinois and California and other states. That is one of the other factors that really makes Utah more predictable and better investment. South Dakota is a no-income tax state. I think South Dakota is going to do very well over the next several years because I understand that the oil and gas play that's in North Dakota is now being found in northern South Dakota. I think that's going to be very much a growth state going forward. Virginia, which benefits a bit, it's probably a little unfair that they rank so highly because they benefit from the federal government being many federal workers being based there. They are a little bit more competitive than otherwise because of the federal government. And then Wyoming and North Dakota round out the top 5. And then the bottom 10, as you can see, one astute viewer a while back had pointed out that, your rankings are all wrong. You know why? California is not in the bottom 10. And so I'm sure you're all asking, where's California? So let me explain. California gets off on a technicality this year. Because you have these expiring tax increases and then you have new tax increases coming on board. But whenever you do a ranking like this, you have to take a snapshot in time where you take your data, and that's the day that you use your data for that year. So as of January 1st, 2012, California had lower taxes. Now, retroactively, you as voters have proven me wrong, unfortunately. And so up until now, we didn't have any errors in this book, but thanks to the voters of California, now I do have an error in the book because retroactively, you applied it as of January 1st, 2012. So in reality, California should be in the bottom 10 states and certainly will be next year when we do the book in the next few months when we go into the 6th edition of the book with the 13% plus income tax rate. California, if I had to guess, will be probably battling it out with Illinois and Vermont for 49 or 50. And giving New York a real run for their money for the dead last. So that's basically that issue of California. So let me add on a better note. I think we certainly do have some challenges at the federal level. We've got fiscal cliff scenarios. We've got some of the highest business taxes in the world, as I mentioned. We've got a lot of problems. We've got gridlock. We've got some real issues at the federal level. But I hope that what you take away from this lecture today, the provocative lecture, is I think we think too much about the federal government sometimes. And the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, for instance, which we've gotten a long ways away from, which is those powers not given directly to the federal government ought to be reserved for the states and the people of the states. And, taking a look into these really interesting 50 laboratories of democracy, I think can tell us a whole lot about the policies that work. That's why ALEC was founded 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, just to examine these type of policies. I think based on our research, you can make a pretty credible case that free markets, limited government, individual responsibility, those principles, the states that follow those principles, are the states that have the best outlook going forward in terms of job creation and a better standard of living. So I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank Professor Ortega for inviting me out here, and it's really been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Yes. And before I get to the questions, I should point out that if you like this type of research, we have a Facebook presence, Rich States, Poor States, and also Twitter, if you're on Twitter, ALEC_tax. There's a question right here.
Have you done a dynamic modeling of California? How much short the $6 billion static analysis the state's claiming that they're going to get in tax increase? How short are they going to be?
Yeah. Yeah, the question, if anybody didn't hear it, was what kind of a dynamic analysis could be done based on California's tax increase? Because based on our experiences from Maryland and some other states, Oregon, New Jersey, many of the states that have relied on income tax increases recently have found that these revenue projections that they thought they were going to get did not come to fruition because of the Laffer curve type of effects, I think. I think that evidence is fairly well documented that people have left those higher tax states in search of greener pastures in other states, especially the more productive entrepreneurial people that would be targeted by these tax increases. That's a really open-ended question. Now, your question alludes to one thing that I think I should touch on briefly, and this is the difference between dynamic and static analysis of tax legislation. And basically, the Laffer curve is dynamic analysis. This is basically behavioral responses, why people change their behavior when tax rates change. Now, many times in the states and in the federal government, believe it or not, as well, we do not even consider the dynamic analysis of a tax provision. We just assume that people won't change their behavior. So there's a famous story. Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee in Washington, D.C. at a time. And what he did was he had a staffer go down to the Joint Committee of Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office, and they said, why don't we take up a proposal up there just for fun? And they designed a bill that said we're going to raise the income tax to 100%. We're going to have 100% marginal personal income tax in the United States. Let's take it down to this static analysis and see what they come up with. What did they come up with? The static analysis came back and said it's going to raise trillions of dollars for the federal government. That's the type of complete insanity that is our static scoring system. And very few states even try to look at a behavioral response to various tax legislation. In the federal government, we don't even try. So to answer your question, I haven't seen one done because we don't have that capability set up in many states. And I certainly do think, based on theory, it's very clear that there will be a dynamic effect, as we've seen in other states. It's just not quite clear what the dollar amount will be of the dynamic effect. Question back here.
Oh, I got a mic. So in your state rankings, New York and California being some of the lowest, they're also home to some of the most innovative companies and continue to attract those companies. So is it just because of the density of the skilled workforce, or do they really care that much about the taxes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'd certainly, like I said, everything matters when it comes to state competitiveness. Workforce development matters a lot. And the challenge is not concentrating exclusively on workforce development, but making sure that you're considering other tax costs as well, regulatory costs, labor costs, because Silicon Valley's here, and it's going to stay here for a foreseeable future, I'm sure, because of the infrastructure that's built around it. And Wall Street's going to stay in New York for the foreseeable future. I'm not suggesting that Wall Street's going to move to North Dakota next year. I don't think that's reasonable to suggest that. However, what I do think is a proper assessment of the situation is if there's a new Silicon Valley and if there's a new Wall Street at any point in time, new innovators, it's not going to be in New York and California. Based on new marginal investment, it's going to go to some place that welcomes the investment. You're not going to see investment necessarily pick up and move. You do see some of that, and you see new investment moving all the time. But the fact of the matter is these incentives matter a ton, and they matter really a ton to new investment of people going forward. But that's a very good question because people ask that all the time. Question over here.
You're a new future resident of Texas, right? Does your analysis take into account, like the registrar, the list of rules and regulations, or especially not unfunded mandates, but no compensation for regulatory takings? Does that factor in? Because California's got everyone beat.
Yeah, the question is do the rankings take into consideration specific numbers of regulations and regulatory takings in a particular state? And the answer to that is no, not directly. We have several variables that get at regulatory policy and do it with some proxies to make it a little bit easier for us to measure. However, your point is well taken, and you noticed that if you go to the top 10 states, Texas didn't fall into the top 10 states. And sometimes people bring that up and are like, wait a minute, I thought Texas was the best state in the country. And they certainly have some great things going for Texas, but they've spent too much money in Texas. They have a relatively large-sized state debt as well, and they have some regulatory problems, as you alluded to. They have very high property taxes as well. And so they generally rank between 10 and 20 in our rankings over the last 5 years of doing this book. They certainly are not a state to demonize generally. However, they do have some areas to get it right. But generally, you can see they've done some good things on medical malpractice reform and tort laws. They've done incredible job keeping income taxes away, so you're not going to be losing your income after you earn it there. But they do have some areas to have some improvement, that's for sure. Question here.
Talk to us about what's happening in Los Angeles and whether or not you think that it's a good idea for Northern California to secede or at least sell Southern California short. What do you think?
Well, let's just put it this way. If I was a business owner, I wouldn't be doing business there. I was talking to some folks in Sacramento earlier this week, and they were legitimately concerned that L.A. is going to be the next on the long list of California municipalities that, go towards bankruptcy proceedings. I'm not sure how close they are, but there certainly is a group of cities that is next in line. I mean, when you have towns like San Bernardino and Stockton and towns of that size going bankrupt, then, how far behind is L.A. County? I know former Mayor Reardon was working on a pension reform effort, but I think he gave up hope recently, is what I heard. And so L.A., of course, is a larger size, which may put off the problem a little bit. However, when the problem hits, it's going to be much larger than the problem in San Jose or some of the other cities, not quite the size of L.A. So I'm very bearish on Southern California, in fact, of L.A. County specifically. San Diego did the right thing, though. You look at their reform proposal on pensions, for instance, and they shift new hires into defined contribution 401k type pensions that the private sector employs. And so I think you see some improvement there, but L.A. County is really a problem.
Would you agree that the tax that best fits the other principles would have a zero marginal tax rate and there would be a fixed cost rather than a variable cost?
Well, obviously, in a perfect world, you'd want to have zero taxes, probably, but you have to fund government somehow.
With a zero marginal tax rate, make taxes a fixed cost
I don't know. That it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. Dealing with the politics at the state level is probably never going to happen. It's an interesting theory to think about, though. That's an interesting point. But certainly the growth maximizing point on the Laffer curve is going to be a 0% tax rate if you're just looking at growth. But then obviously there's some public spending that has positive benefits, infrastructure and some other spending. So you could justify, say, the growth maximizing points above zero someplace. But certainly in a perfect world where you didn't need government, the growth maximizing point would be zero.
Right, but would you agree that there's one tax that does not have a Laffer curve, and that is a land tax? And that would be a zero marginal tax rate.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting to think about. I haven't spent much time on that, though.
Would even a tax on land have a Laffer curve in the sense that if you raise the tax to a level which the owner couldn't afford, the owner has to go out?
Yeah, as long as people have freedom of movement. Yeah, if you have alternatives to choose between, that certainly people can, leave.
Question on the spending side. Now that it looks like there's no stopping Obamacare, what do you see as being the effects on state Medicaid spending, these new insurance exchanges? How is that going to affect the business?
Yeah, the question is about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, and what that's going to mean for state finances. And, when it comes to pensions, I think that's the number one problem. But closely behind is what is going to happen with health care costs. There's a huge question mark of state policymakers, and we just convened a meeting last week in Washington where we had about 800 policymakers there for our conference. And as you talk to people, you get about 800 different answers to how they think it's going to play out with Medicaid expansion and also with the exchanges. So right now you have about half the states saying they're not going to do the exchange, and you have half the states that are going to do the exchange. It's not really clear what's going to happen and where the stick instead of the carrot's going to be for the states that don't do the exchange the way that the Obama administration wants them to do the exchange. The other big policy reason or big policy choice that states are going to have to decide is this Medicaid expansion question, is do we want to spend more of our dollars going forward because we get a federal match and expand Medicaid eligibility, or do we say, no, we do not? And that's going to be a big unresolved question going forward, and I have more questions than I do answers on those because big question mark, and it could be a big financial obligation for the states, certainly. Well, like I said, ALEC is a group of bipartisan state legislators. We do work with Democrats and Republicans, and we have to make these cases, in a persuasive way that persuade people with the data, even apart from the ideological side of things. And that's why I like to talk about the public finance aspect of, for instance, income taxes versus consumption taxes for viability of state revenue, for instance. I think there's a lot of arguments that you can make that appeal to even middle-of-the-road type Republicans or Democrats. Like I said, especially the pension issue. This is not a partisan issue right now. This is something where everybody agrees we need to come together and get this taken care of. Now, we may disagree on some of the solutions, but at least at this point, I think everybody agrees that there's a problem here. And so we try to do it on as a bipartisan basis as possible. But that's a trend among the states today where you see really the death of the conservative Democrat and the liberal Republican. So if you follow state legislators and their elections over the years, you had this very core group of conservative Democrats from southern states that really ran the southern states, and you had liberal Republicans for the most part running New England. And then over years now, and this is almost this change in terms of political scientists found pretty interesting over the years. This change is almost complete now, where conservative Republicans, for the most part, control southern states, and now liberal Democrats, for the most part, control New England. And so, with that being said, you have somewhat of a less receptive ears to this Jeffersonian type message of limited government, lower taxes, and federalism. But we need to do a better job as free market advocates making the case to anybody who will listen to us. And I'll leave it at that. We're a 501c3 organization. We're nonpartisan, and we have to be. So we have a lot of Democrat members that I'm proud that we've been able to talk to and make progress on these issues. I'd have to check our rolls about California. There are term limits in California, and we've lost a lot. So a question in the back row. Mm-hmm.
Unimproved value of land, because that has a lot of advantages which you seem to associate with other taxes that you're recommending.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's been an issue I've tangentially looked at, but I can't say that I know enough about the issue to actually give you a full response on that. But Professor Ortega may have an answer for us.
You're saying then that somebody doesn't see in a piece of undeveloped land the potential to develop it, and that there incorporates the value of the land in different uses and different methods. But we'll talk about that at Flames. My next question is, have you looked at the kind of intrastate movements of capital or the policies that direct resources from the city level, local level, and aggregate at the state level, and compare states' ability to disaggregate versus aggregating resources?
That's an interesting topic. I mean, this is almost like I've actually tried to convince some state-level groups to put together this type of research that's very detailed, county by county. You could call it rich county, poor county, I guess, if you wanted to take off of rich states, poor states. But that's very interesting. And some states have gone, like Kansas, for instance. They've had a problem with rural development, for instance. In western Kansas is really depopulated. There's certain counties out there that have maybe 100 people that live in the county. Super unpopulated. So one of the things that Governor Brownback has done recently is actually way outside the norm, but what he did was have a rural empowerment zone where anybody moving to one of those counties was exempt from state income tax for 5 years. And gave them a pretty direct incentive to go and actually move into some of those areas that was not getting the attention based on just market conditions. And so basically what you have in a lot of those states is, in Kansas, all the population is concentrated in Wichita, Topeka, and the Kansas City area, and then the entire western side has been depopulating. It's been kind of an issue for services. They've talked about sharing school districts and consolidating county governments even. But that's one of the approaches that Governor Brownback has taken out there. It's outside the box, but we'll see how it works in terms of economic development across counties. One of the interesting aspects, and getting a little bit off your question, but is really the cross-border activity that we see when we talk about state-to-state economic development and activity in rich states, poor states. If you were to take it down a little bit of a smaller level and look at, for instance, some of the states that have the largest differentials on certain taxes, and maybe even their taxes on things like tobacco and alcohol and those type of products. But if you were to look, let's say, at a high tax state bordering a low tax state and look at the counties that are on the state line. For instance, in Washington, D.C., we have Maryland and Virginia. So these two states are kind of the emblematic of Maryland being the high tax model, Virginia being the low tax model. So what happens on some of these cross-border activities? So this is interesting. So on cigarettes, for instance, Maryland has raised their cigarette tax several times over the last several years. So they have about, I believe it's a $2 per pack cigarette tax. Virginia is one of the lower cigarette tax states, as you can imagine, where they still have a lot of tobacco grown there. I think it's about 30 cents a pack. So you have a tax differential of $1.70 per pack, not per carton, but per pack. So you can imagine the incentive that it gives people to shift behavior and shift purchases. So actually, there's been so much of this behavior that's happened. The state of Maryland has created this special enforcement division where they have people that stand along the Virginia border and watch for people that might be going to Virginia to buy contraband product and bring it back to the state of Maryland. And if you have a certain percentage that they deem non-residential use, they will actually fine you or confiscate the product as you're trying to bring it back. And so some of that really micro cross-border stuff is really interesting on the county level.
Well, we're going to have an interesting example with San Jose City recently enacting a $10 minimum wage relative to $8 roughly in Campbell, Mountain View, and every other little city around. So you guys can predict what will happen there.
Yeah, any good economics student can predict what can happen as minimum wages go up. As the advocates like to point out, this is going to create prosperity, as they like to say. But, why don't we just take it to the logical extreme and have a $100 per hour minimum wage and see what happens to jobs? That's all I'll say about that for the moment.
I saw on NPR, so not exactly a right-wing organization.
Yeah.
They had a panel of economists of all political stripes, and one of the few things they all agreed on was that production-based taxation is inefficient and distortionary and generally a bad way to raise revenue. So, I mean, if this is kind of the consensus, what's stopping policymakers from listening?
That's a good question there. And, and people like PBS, NPR doing these type of panels, it's very telling. OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, certainly not a right-wing think tank, which follows the developed world economies. They actually came up with a similar ranking where they say taxes on production and capital are the most damaging all the way down to consumption. So this is pretty established in theory, and it's not just a right-wing, talking point here. And so what I think keeps us away from taxing the things that are least damaging and continuing to tax production and capital is probably a bit of the progressive worldview when it comes to wanting to redistribute. And I think that's really one of the key policy objectives that some people have, that they say, we don't care about efficiency, we care about redistribution. And I think that's really the reason. Now, when it comes to tax policy, one of the key principles across the states especially is there's been lots of academic work to say that there is no such thing as being able to redistribute income from state to state just because of the high mobility of people being able to move and get away from it. It just doesn't happen at the state level especially. But really one of the axioms of tax policy is taxes do not redistribute income, they redistribute people. And that's one of the main stories of rich states, poor states, is as long as the people have freedom of association and can leave when they feel that they're being discriminatorily taxed or punitively taxed, they will, when you give them enough incentive. And that's why it's really a fool's errand to rely too heavily on taxes on production or capital.
Next time you have Mr. Brownback of Kansas here, maybe you should encourage him to populate Western Kansas by making it something called New Singapore. Perhaps just take away most everything and see what happens.
Well, I'll relay that message to him.
How would you respond to somebody who says, in the 1950s, there were rather high federal tax rates, and yet there was economic growth, and there was investment and growth in the 1990s before the Bush tax cuts?
Right. Well, the 1990s, I think, is probably a little bit easier to answer, I would assume, because, relatively speaking, tax rates were still in the 30s in the 1990s. So previously, of course, before the Reagan tax cuts of the early 80s, we were looking at marginal rates in the 70s. Taxes throughout the 90s averaged in the 30s, and probably started the decade around 28 at the end of the Reagan administration there. And so we forget sometimes that in the Clinton years, we actually had a capital gains tax cut that was brokered as a bipartisan deal from Republicans who controlled Congress and President Bill Clinton, who thought this was something that I think he maybe vetoed it a time or two before signing it, but he ended up signing it, and it brought a new wave of help there in terms of the economy. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to the era of the 1950s to help explain that. I think that there's certainly been some good work done there, but I'm certainly not an expert to speak about the era of the 1950s on that type of marginal rate side.
One comment I would make in that vein is that back then there were a lot more ways to avoid that tax rate. So, like, for example, you could have a country club membership, and that would force you to use a bar, and those kinds of things from that tax. So it still goes with the last part of argument about very high tax rates not raising that much revenue, but at the same time it doesn't necessarily mean high tax rates cut off all economic activities if you have ways of avoiding that.
That's a very good point. And that was actually something I was going to bring up is, we have this thing in economics called Hauser's Law, right, where we look at, you could even go back to the 50s and look at Hauser's Law and the implications for the 50s, that even though marginal rates have varied dramatically from the 90s and the 1950s to the 20s and then back up now to the high 30s, the revenue as a percentage of our federal GDP has remained almost consistent over that period, regardless of what's happened to rates. And so I think, to your point, there's a lot of ways to avoid taxes at that level where it wasn't as big of a drag on economic growth because people could find fairly easily ways around it. I think is probably the best explanation that I've seen. And believe it or not, if you look at the state level, you can make a very strong case that there's a state level version of Hauser's Law where above a certain marginal tax rate, you're not going to get, in terms of revenue as a percentage of the state GSP, any benefit from it. And that marginal rate, I believe, is right around 6%. So you can tell California is way on the wrong side of that law at the state level. Another question here.
Just along the same lines, I don't know what the relationship is, but the levels at which these high marginal rates take effect are affected by inflation. So, like price inflation, however you want to look at it. So, maybe that's the same thing that you're alluding to when you talk about when you talk in terms of percentage of GDP or something like that. There was a relationship. I'm not sure it's the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're referring to is the issue of bracket creep, and so this is something that Friedman and some of the others were very keen on changing at the federal level. So now we index the brackets, we index personal exemptions and deductions and that standard deduction, that type of thing to inflation now to protect against this type of bracket creep, but not the alternative minimum tax. So the AMT, which is basically this alternative tax code entirely, you could almost run the entire system based on just the AMT code versus the present code. And some may make sense that it might be even a better code than the current code. I wouldn't want to make that argument. But as part of the fiscal cliff deal, the AMT patch is going away. And it's going to affect maybe another 25 million Americans, they're estimating. It's starting to get into incomes in the 5-figure range now, where it's affecting more and more working families. It's going to be a big deal. But at the state level, actually, there are some states that don't adjust their tax brackets and deductions and exemptions to inflation. And so we still do have that bracket creep problem at the state level, although we fixed it at the federal level.
Except on capital gains.
Yes. Yes, and that's a big one on capital gains, because your value of the gain over time, if you've held it for 20 years, is certainly not the value as it was when you first gained it. Last question. I think we had a hand up. You have another question?
I was just going to mention, I'm pretty sure that during the 1950s there were about 3 recessions, so it may not have been quite as perfect as we seem to think it is.
Yeah, it's probably far from a perfect experiment, but I think the answer to that falls mostly along the lines of how easy it was to evade. And, when you have a marginal tax rate at that level, the incentive that you give people to evade is extremely high. And that's something that often, times when we talk about low rates and broad bases, one of the reasons we like that is you don't play favorites, but also you give people the lowest incentive possible to evade, because rational human beings are going to evade if you give them high enough incentive, and based on good tax policy principles, we want to avoid that. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you.